Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala ashraf al-anbiya wa mursaleen. نبينا وقدوتنا محمد عليه أفضل الصلاة وأزكى التسليم. اللهم علمنا بما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Everybody with us in person and online to Sunday evening Reforming the Self with Raghib Asfahani's Dhariyah ila Makarim Shariah, the path to developing virtue. And that's a poor man's translation, because Makarim Shariah is, we could use an entire paragraph to translate it. It's developing within ourselves the characteristics and qualities that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Shariah, His Shariah, demands of us in order to fulfill our potential, which is Khilafatullah, which is being Allah's stewards and successors upon this earth in His creation, managing things the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants them to be managed. And so we're in the second section of the book that specifically deals with knowledge and everything related to it. One of those things being learning and education. And the last couple classes, we talked about a very, very important part of the book where Raghib Asfahani detailed essential characteristics of students and essential characteristics of good teachers. Right? So just a brief recap of those. Some of the essential characteristics for students that he outlined was, first and foremost, purifying yourself from poor etiquette. And he mentions just a few. He says purifying yourself from haste, because it's disrespectful to the subject material that you're studying. It's an overstatement of your own abilities and powers, right? The person who realizes that success is truly in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they're not hasty about what they're about to learn. They know that everything is going to happen in Allah's time. And there's nothing that, well, I should say, you can take the means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has provided, but you're not going to move faster than Allah has willed. And purifying yourself from jealousy. Regretfully, and I've mentioned when we were in the past few weeks some personal experience with jealousy among, students of knowledge and imams and all those sorts of things. Regretfully, it's a major part of the dawah scene, and we ask Allah to purify our hearts. The author mentioned focusing on your studies, not getting distracted by the dunya, and that doesn't mean that you're some sort of hermit that only focuses on what you learn. However, this is a probabilistic kind of advice, because most people will let the dunya get in the way of themselves learning new things, as opposed to the opposite scenario. Very few are the people that are so dedicated to what they're trying to learn that they don't take time for their dunya, either their family or their job or making money or things like that. So being organized, scheduling your time. The author noted being humble or avoiding arrogance when it comes to both your instructor and the subject material that you're studying. And this is a huge one. Anyone who has teenage boys can relate, right? You try to tell a teenage boy something, and I was one of them. I know. That's the response that you're very likely to get. What can we say? It's something that's very natural, but it's something that everybody has to struggle against. And there's various sort of symptoms of that kind of disease of the heart: arrogance towards the instructor, thinking that you know more, thinking that the instructor kind of isn't being judicious with what they're teaching you or how they're teaching you or the pace upon which they're putting you, etc., etc. And then towards the material itself, right? Whether it's, most people have a pretty decent respect for the Islamic sciences, but let's just say if somebody imagined that you could get the same or equivalent as a 6-year Medina education with, your Google search, right? That would be something that is an affront to kind of the subject itself, right? Treating the subject as something that's shallow enough that could be grasped, or even just the office of fatwa or the office of religious advice. Imagining that the few sites that we have in English, such as Seeker's Guidance and Islamic Q&A and all these sorts of things, barely scratch the surface. barely scratch the surface of what there is when it comes to fiqh and studying the Shariah, as it would be for medicine, as it would be for engineering, any other subject, right? I mean, I'm sure doctors are very frustrated with people who do their own research and come in and think they've got it all figured out, right? About what's their diagnosis, and just doctor, please give me this medicine because I've already decided that I've got this. Such a person is foolish because they've maybe they've noticed one thing, however, there's a whole lot more that they're missing, and so their own diagnosis can often be fatal, right? The same exact thing applies to religious studies. How many times have I've been asked a question, and the question I'm asked is very carefully worded so that it's very narrow in scope, and then you start to ask a couple follow-up questions and you realize that there's something a lot bigger going on, right? Famous example is when I was taught by one of my mentors, where a husband called the imam to complain about his wife. His wife had stopped praying, right? No more namaz. And so the imam was called in. He's like, this is terrible. He comes in and, he's kind of prepped as if he just has to explain to the wife and lay the law down and kind of tell her that she needs to be praying, et cetera, et cetera. When he gets there, he comes to find out that, the husband had attempted to wake her up for Fajr one day, not with a little sprinkling of water, but with a bucket of ice cold water. And that in protest, she had abandoned her namaz or her salah, which obviously is a different problem, but it had a clear cause and something that the husband was not completely forthcoming with. So this also happens in marriage counseling all the time. You never ever, and this is the lesson that we learn from Sulaiman, right, in the Quran, you never judge based off of one person's side of the story. There's always a second side of the story. And the due diligence that's required of, just like a doctor, to get medical history, to get contraindications, to get, other things like that. Someone in the religious sciences, their due diligence is to assess the entire situation, get various points of view before dropping the hammer or hitting the gavel, so to speak. And this is all touched on by the author. He stresses the importance of someone being docile, with the literal meaning of the word, right? Willing to be molded and willing to be transformed. When you're a student of something, you can't see the end game, right? You don't know exactly the type of person that you're going to be when you come out of it. So there's a certain trust, and it's a two-way street, but there's a certain trust of submitting yourself to the edifying forces or the transformative forces of your instructors. And if you have good instructors, that transformative process is enriching, and you come out a better person, a different person, a wiser person at the end of the education. And that's exactly how it's supposed to be, how it's supposed to go. But that's a perfect segue to the other side, which is that, there are a lot of phony, bad teachers out there. And all of this process depends upon a good teacher, whether it's Islam, the religious subjects, or anything else, medicine, engineering, take your pick, right? So the teacher, they have to treat their students with the concern of a parent, right? It has to be beyond, you're not a computer that's downloading a hard drive onto an empty kind of motherboard, and then you're just kind of evaluating for regurgitation, right? That's the very mechanistic imagination for how learning should happen. No, the person that's studying is a whole person. They have motivations, they have issues in their personal life. And so a true teacher has to be sensitive to all those sorts of things. Even with children, children have issues going on at home, right? Sometimes their parents are going through a divorce. Sometimes they're going through a move. We have now these big apartment buildings right on Genesee that just got, condemned, and everybody's evicted, and now they're in shelters all around. A teacher can't throw the book at a student who has, special circumstances. They have to be sensitive to these sorts of things and always prioritize the relationship to learning and try to plan around these sorts of things as they come up. And we had that happen last year in Sunday school. There was one family that they never technically finished the course, because they basically were kind of, their living situation had become in jeopardy at the end. So they weren't able to take the final exam. right? A good teacher has to be sensitive to those things and has to respond to those things with more than just pointing to the rules and saying, well, it's against the rules and you're going to get it. So the other thing that the teacher must do, and this is something that regretfully I haven't seen very much of, is the teacher should engender cooperation and love between their students, right? This is the antidote to the jealousy that we see between, speakers or callers or scholars or imams or any other sort of thing. You hear horror stories about law school, people ripping out pages in the, in the books in the library and things like that. Everybody just trying to get a leg up on somebody else. That's a failed system of whole person education, because you've just sort of tested for the regurgitation. All you care about is the evaluation, and you don't really are attentive to what are the means that your students are taking to get there. Huge problem, right? In Islam, we're educating the whole person, and all of the points in the world are not worth it. The highest marks in the world are not worth it if there have been shortcuts that have been taken to get there, or they've been obtained in an illegitimate way. So that falls on the teacher. The teacher has to be sensitive to those things. They have to develop a sense of honor, a sense of dignity within their students. They have to develop a sense of cooperation and kind of team identity with their students, and not just kind of play off every individual against each other, kind of every man for themselves. And it's the teacher's responsibility to, just like if it's going to be a doctor or an imam, to put the student on a track of development, right? To not throw everything on them at once or belittle them, for their lack of knowledge or any of these sorts of things that might have unintended and negative consequences, right? The teacher has to deal with the person where they're at, take into account what they're likely to implement. Just like if you, there's so many parallels between being an imam and being a doctor. We're the doctors of the soul, and the doctors are the doctors of the body, because you can probably tell, I'm guessing, a certain patient, how likely they are to actually take your recommendations, right? If you can write all the prescriptions in the world, you pretty much know before they step out the door, that person is going to take it or that person is not going to do a thing that I said to do, right? So it's an art. It's not a science to try to reach somebody in a way that motivates them, to try to break things down in small enough pieces that they're digestible to that person, to kind of speak to that person at their level. And even if you do the best job that you could possibly do, objectively speaking, it's not always going to work. There's always going to be people who just are trying to use you for the script, or in our case, use you for the fatwa, or use you for the nikah, as the case may be. And actually the author is going to deal with that a little bit today, when he comes to an interesting chapter, which, who is it obligatory to prevent knowledge from? Kind of a foreign concept to us when we think about knowledge as being something that should be free and accessible to everybody. That's generally true, but the author has an interesting kind of pre-modern take on that. And then, the author had gone into a really beautiful kind of defense of Socratic method, I guess you could say, when it comes to learning and education, getting people to come to conclusions themselves, as opposed to this kind of spoon feeding model, which is regretfully the model that they use in Medina, and not every single class, but the majority of kind of the educational culture there. And I'm guessing a lot of places throughout the Muslim world is mostly based off of memorization and not based off of understanding. And here's the exact opposite. We never memorized anything, growing up, where we could have used, I think, a little bit of muscle memory development, right? But it is a good thing to focus on understanding. But if you look at the Muslim community, and I was actually on a Zoom call with the doctor that was visiting, who's from Jordan, who's one of the professors. I would talk to his class this morning. And that was one of the reflections I had. The students were asking me about the difference between education systems and the East versus West. And I said that we really need a happy medium somewhere in the middle, because in the Muslim world we've produced so many memorizers and so few people who understand and can apply things critically. Whereas in the West, all we do is critique. My first degree was from Vassar College and a liberal arts school, and we were taught to critique the first day we walked in, before we even understood the things we were critiquing. right? So there's two extremes, and as usual, Islam is in the middle, between two extremes. And so there's a humility to mastery, and then there's room for critical application, and both of those things in any sort of Islamic pedagogy or sort of method of Islamic teaching should kind of shoot for that middle, where it's not merely regurgitation, it's not lower order thinking skills. Okay, 5 pillars of Islam are this. Yes, kindergartners, that's where you have to start. But you want to be able to move to higher order thinking skills. What is it about the human beings that requires the prayer? What are the things about the human being that require devotion, any relationship to Allah in the first place, right? What is the purpose of zakat at a societal level? Why does logic and reason and kind of our empirical observation necessitate monotheism, right? These sorts of things, higher order thinking skills, getting people to think about the types of different idolatry that there are. External idolatry is relatively unknown in the West. It's more of an internal idolatry, idolizing the self and idolizing kind of desires, right? So getting people to think critically about that should be the method and the goal of Islamic education. And the author, he's writing in the 1,000 years ago. He's talking about this stuff, not with the exact same examples, but he says, it's better to get your students to conclude for themselves. It's more honorable for both the student and the teacher. He says explicitness only has one dimension, whereas implicit instruction, you can uncover things that you never even realized before, right? The student is now contributing to the education, right? As opposed to just the teacher, just, again, spoon feeding and downloading. And finally, and again, anybody who's raises boys can attest to this, implicit education, or I should say, I'll go the other way. Explicit education invites contrarianism and opposition and combativeness, right? And I was this way, so I know. When I was a teenager growing up, you try to tell me something. No, it's not. It's this other way. No, you're wrong. No, I'll prove you wrong, right? Whereas if you're putting a problem in front of a student and you're letting them solve the problem with what they already know, and just a couple little, pointing and gesturing here and there, then the person has ownership over the conclusion, right? You've helped them teach themselves, essentially, as opposed to you setting yourself up for a battle, like this is the way it is. No, it's not, and et cetera, et cetera. So the next chapter that the author goes to, again, like an interesting thing that might kind of be scandalous to a modern sensibility. He titles the chapter "The Necessity of Preventing Ignorant People from Certain Types of Knowledge," and limiting things to what people can understand or grasp. So he cites a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, and this is an authentic hadith. وَنُكَلِّمَ النَّاسِ عَلَى قَدْرِ عُقُولِهِمْ. Right? The Prophet ﷺ, when he would send people to instruct, because the Prophet ﷺ was often in the position where he was sending out teachers and emissaries to different parts of the Arabian Peninsula to instruct, he always warned people to speak to them at the level of their intellect, right? And in one narration, is it in the book or no? Yes. كَلِمُوا النَّاسِ بِمَا يَعْرِفُونَ وَدَعُوا مَا يُنْكِرُونَ أَتُرِيدُونَ أَنْ يُكَذِّبُوا اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ. That's very strong wording. Prophet ﷺ said, speak to people with what they know. Utilize the things that they already know and leave what they have an aversion to, right? And then he pairs this instruction with the reason, which he says, do you want people to deny Allah and his messenger? Right? He says that the ultimate goal here is to get people to accept Allah and his messenger. And the Prophet ﷺ is implicitly teaching us that the methods that we use, the language that we speak, the examples that we use, the things that we choose for illustration, it can make it or break it. Yes. There's no sort of reason to resort to scandal, to divisive things, to things that are not kind of universally accepted and known. Now, this kind of shows us a lot of different lessons on a lot of different levels. First of all, we notice discretion, right? Not every single thing is suitable for every single ear, right? You have lots of different people. In our community, small community here, you have lots of different people with different backgrounds, varying sort of capacities for understanding. I'm going to have a different conversation with other Medina grads and other imams that are colleagues of mine. We might look at an issue from a very theoretical sort of perspective. We might entertain possibilities or very minority opinions that we might not want to publicize for fear of somebody grasping onto it and running with it, right? And this sort of thing happens all the time. They actually talk about it. Scholars who analyze kind of society and media, they call it context collapse, right? So what have we found in the age of social media is that all context has been collapsed. You used to be a son to your parents and a brother to your siblings and a spouse to your spouse, and etc. And you had a slightly different identity with all of them. And that's not hypocritical. That's not two-faced. That's actually very, very useful because they call for different kind of behaviors and comportment. If you talk to your parents, you need to be humble and you need to put yourself kind of in their service, and you're going to be much less bold with the things that you assert and, kind of take their lead. If you're talking with colleagues or students, for example, you're going to have an entirely different sort of demeanor. You might resort to entirely different examples or illustrations, etc., right? So now what we have is social media where someone downloads a video or uploads a video on YouTube, and you can't control for for social class or for intelligence or for expertise or anything. It's out there, and it's out there. You have the person who is thinking about becoming a Muslim can listen to it, and Yasser Qadi can listen to it if he wants to, and everybody in between, right? And that has landed a lot of people into problems because you need to be very, very, very have a lot of foresight as to how things can be misconstrued, and that discretion is part of the Sunnah. That discretion is part of the action and instruction of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and also part of the practice of the companions. I always share the story of the Kaaba. As you all probably well know by now, the Kaaba was meant to be rebuilt. The Prophet ﷺ, he said to Aisha a few years before he passed ﷺ, that if he had his druthers, if he had it his way, he would have rebuilt the Kaaba to its original shape. He would have made 2 doors at ground level, not the high, basketball hoop height door that you see now, right? But he said the reason why he didn't do it was because the Quraysh were new to Islam, right? So this is exactly how the Prophet ﷺ put this instruction into practice. He knew that messing with the Kaaba was something that would be rejected by the Quraysh. It would seem like a power grab. It would seem like a move for his legacy, just like any head of state or king wants to build something to be remembered by, some sort of monument, etc., etc. He knew that that's how it was going to be interpreted, and so he didn't touch it. Even if he had a preference, he had a certain wish, he wanted it to be a certain way. He had to take into consideration the state of the people that he was operating amongst. And so we find this with every single thing. One story that happened here, there was a gentleman that came in here. He was interested in Islam. I wasn't here at this point, but I was told about it after I came. And he had a girlfriend. And it wasn't just your normal fling. It was like some people have very committed relationships. They were in a relationship for years, and he had heard someone had told him, a Muslim, a do-gooder Muslim had told him that girlfriends are haram, right? So oh, you want to be a new Muslim? Is that your girlfriend? Astaghfirullah, right? But he heard it, cat's out of the bag. Okay, so he's talking to one of the brothers from our community, and he was doing a good job, and the brother asked him, like, I heard this, someone told me that I can't have a girlfriend and be a Muslim. Is that true? And he stalled for time. He's like, well, let me think about it. I need to go, but eventually he told him, he's like, it's what you heard is true. We don't approve of girlfriends in Islam. He never saw that guy again, right? So you have somebody that he could have had an argument in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the afterlife, right? He could have been a believer, and Allah can guide anyone he wants right? Once they're through the door, only Allah knows what's going to happen. Better to have a Muslim living in sin than somebody who just completely doesn't even take the testimony of faith despite feeling that way internally, right? Much, much more grave implications in the afterlife, and Allah knows best as to what will happen, of course, right? So that's the sort of thing that we're dealing with. You have to anticipate, you have to have foresight, you have to think, and you have to take into consideration the situation of the people that you're talking to. You're going to talk to a doctor, different than you're going to talk to an engineer, different than you're going to talk to somebody who spent 20 years in jail, different than you're going to talk to a farmer, right? If I give farming metaphors to Dr. Muhsin, I don't know, maybe he has experience with farming, but maybe, in all likelihood, he doesn't, right? 1 second, I gotta make sure this is plugged in. For some reason, it's telling me the battery's almost out. Something's not plugged in somewhere. That was it. Okay, good. Dr. Muhsin, mashallah, he goes berry picking, and that's all well and good, but, when I start talking about nutrient cycles and the water cycle and crop rotation and things like that, and I did a little bit of farming, so I have a little bit of experience in that. It's a different animal. It's not the best selection on my part. If I want him, I'm trying to teach him something that he has to understand about his religion that's going to help his afterlife, right? I would give him examples from the human anatomy, from medicine, from these sorts of things. And the opposite. You go to a farmer or you go to a mechanic. There's one brother in the community, he's a truck driver. I always try to give him car metaphors, mechanic metaphors, because that's what he does all day long. I was explaining to him why he has to study tajweed and why he was having such difficulty with it. He actually felt like, because we were getting deep into the rules of tajweed, and he said that he experienced that he was starting to get all these sort of doubts, and it was becoming almost like worse initially than how he used to read before. And I told him, I said, okay, you, in your truck, you have an engine. He's like, yeah. It's like, what happens? What's the difference between a person who just gets in the truck and turns the key and goes versus somebody who takes the engine out and, takes apart the entire engine so they see every single piece, they know how it fits together, and then puts it back together? It's like, you don't have an engine when you've taken everything apart. But when you put it all back together, you're going to be much more better. You're going to be better off than the person who never took it apart in the first place. And he totally got it, and he stuck with it, and he ended up, mashallah, he improved a lot. I'm very, very proud of his progress. So you have to teach. This is the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. This is the sunnah of the companions, to address people and treat people not in a condescending way, but out of sincerity and wanting them to absolutely get the message accurately, to use examples, to mention what's only going to benefit them, and do it in a way where it's going to be grasped. And I have to mention this, when we look at some of the contemporary social justice movements that we find, we see how they sputter and die because of a lack of this sort of ethic, right? Let's take defund the police, right? That's one of the calls for today. Even if you go into and try to understand exactly what they mean, it's not as bad as it sounds, right? If you look at the comparative budgets between the police departments and other sort of things like education, et cetera, they're trying to communicate that, resources should be allocated with a little bit more equity between these sorts of things. We don't need to be spending as much money. Horrible messaging. Absolutely horrible messaging. Why? Like it's almost as if they didn't want to succeed. They were just content with being thinking that they're right and didn't care who believed them or who didn't believe them, right? And this is something that you find with a lot of the social justice movements these days. They've lost the ethic of trying to earnestly be understood, right? They've taken the moral victory, right? It's like, well, we're right, and so who cares? Everybody else is just a yokel. They don't understand our utopian, ideology. Okay, great, you can be right, but you're not going to get anywhere. Islam is a practical faith. It's a practical religion. There's no merit in picking obscure language or something that is, like the Prophet ﷺ said, yunkirun, something that the people find detestable or something that they react to with this kind of visceral reaction. You have to choose things that are going to be applauded and things that are well recognized and understood with the people. Good. And this also applies to, within Islamic history or Muslim history, we also find that there are esoteric, right, strains, right, where all these sorts of very symbolic language and the language itself, it's like, I know it looks like shirk, but it's not shirk, right? They try to explain to you, it's like, this isn't really, like worshiping other than Allah. It's actually this, it's this metaphor. It's like, okay, I can believe you enough to believe that you're sincere, and, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt, but this is not an Islamic ethic, right? To choose words that can be so easily misinterpreted, to choose metaphors that are provocative, right? Or that stir people to kind of in a divisive way. That's not the way of the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ never did that, and the companions never did that. And the Prophet ﷺ was not, part of his station of prophethood was that he was the best teacher, right? So if you have tricks and techniques from the best teacher, then we would hope that we would avail ourselves of them and not kind of invent our own sort of methodology of teaching. It also violates the ethic within Islam to stick to the jama'ah, right? We don't have an elitist kind of ethic within Islam where we imagine that there's just sort of an elite vanguard of people that are going to just change the society, and the masses kind of just stick to, the Shariah, and that's good for them, and whatever, right? Everybody has a brain, and everybody has an intellect, and everybody, the author has gone at length to try to convince us that everybody should be involved in developing that, right? And there's different, everybody's going to take it to a different extent. Not everybody's going to reach the same sort of goal, but part of the worship of a Muslim is developing their intellect and developing themselves, right? And so we're kind of a much more pluralistic ethic. The Prophet ﷺ said, stick to the jama'ah, right? Actually, he was asked by Mu'adh, said, what if we reach this end time and we find that there's all these sorts of firaq, he used the word, like these sort of sects, and they're all saying, I have the truth, no, I have the truth. And the Prophet ﷺ didn't say, like, pick one and go with it. He said, avoid all of them. He said, utruku hadhihi al-firaq kullaha. He said, like, leave all of these sects and stick to the jama'ah, right? That basic kind of Muslim, ethos, or the lowest common denominator of our Islamic culture. There's something that is humble and stable and safe in that. There's no need to belittle it. Okay, good. So upon what grounds should someone be prevented knowledge? That's the kind of proposition that the author is putting here. He's not saying, well, he gestures at first, he said, okay, when it comes to people's intellect, it's more about timing, right? It's not that you're going to brand somebody as stupid and just say, it's like, well, you can't learn this, and never teach them. No. When it comes to intellect, it's about timing and development, all right? You want everybody to be on a path of progress, and you're developing them. And so you're going to expose them to things when they're ready to them. Who's the only type of person that you should completely bar all knowledge to? What do you think? Hey, that's exactly what he says. Somebody who's not pure with their intention, somebody who has poor character, right? And so this is a whole different dimension of being a teacher that in the West we're not used to. He's saying that the teacher has to look into the character of his students and be able to tell who's jealous, and be able to tell who's in it for the ego, and be able to tell who, if they take that little bit of knowledge, whether it's medicine or engineering or, God forbid, the religion, that if they run with it and they go make a YouTube channel and they have one of these tabloid-like, YouTube channels where they're calling out this guy and that guy and that guy, that this is the type of person that, sorry, like, you have to do some work before you can come and study. Like, before you're going to be taught this, you need to be on some sort of program. You need to engage in some sort of activity, some personal development, so that the knowledge that you learn becomes a proof for you and not a proof against you. And we say this phrase often. It's directly translated from the Arabic phrase, but it's a real thing. right? So that's a really interesting and important distinction. We're not talking about branding people, tracking people, right? You don't throw the special ed kids in the basement, right? They do in in schools here, and the school that I grew up in New Jersey, right? And then put the AP, in the bright classrooms with the nice windows and everything. No, we're not talking about that. We're talking about the people who have disease in their hearts, the people who, if they are taught certain things, they're just going to spread evil, right? These are the type of people that need to be prevented until they remedy themselves somehow. So purification comes first. And we see the effects of this. And one of them I already mentioned, the two examples that came to my mind. One of them is kind of how this kind of clickbait, tabloid-esque ethic has taken over a lot of YouTube channels, a lot of people who call to Islam. It's all kind of driven by scandal. It's all like taking sound bites from people out of context and say, oh, look what he said. Or, oh, look, he sat with so-and-so. He must collaborate with this group and that group, and he must, all these kinds of guilt by association tactics. And at the end of the day, and at someone from the inside, I can tell you that at the end of the day, this is all about personal vendettas. It's all about jealousy. If it goes back to it, you can trace some people were students of the same sheikh, and they were both jealous to try to compete to be, more in favor of the same sheikh. And then because they both have a little bit of religious education, now it's, oh, well, he collaborates with us. They give a religious veneer to their actual personal vendetta, right? Oh, well, he sits with these group and this, and so that means that he's, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's one thing that we've gotten to. And the other thing that we consider, the other example or arena in which we can see this at work is the Orientalist scholars, right? The non-Muslim scholars, not all of them, but traditionally or historically, the ones that study Islam and produce quote unquote knowledge within Islamic studies in Western universities. The types of things that they come up with, you just have to scratch your head. Like there are some people who claim that the Quran was not originally in Arabic, it was originally in Syriac, and it was copied from this, this obscure person, and then it was lost. All these sorts of crazy theories. You have people, you see the results of the Western education model with absolutely no attention paid to purification or sincerity, right? You have people that are just trying to make their careers. That's what it comes down to. And if you have to always look at the conflicts of interest that are involved and what is this type of education incentivizing? And this is true in the Western Academy, if the incentive is to produce groundbreaking material, and it always is, and the incentive is to somehow distinguish yourself and make a niche and make a name for yourself, then you created an incentive structure where somebody has a vested interest in doing something that's kind of scandalous and off the wall. And so you'll find a lot of stuff within the Orientalist kind of vein about Islam, off the wall stuff, right? Anything that comes from traditional Islamic sources is kind of like, they turn up their nose at it and say, oh, this stuff, is just fairy tales and et cetera, et cetera. And the things that they actually rely on are fairly, comes down to grasping at straws and is really some far-fetched stuff. And it's gotten better. I think it's gotten better in the last 10, 15 years, but definitely the average kind of pull errs on that side. And I've spoken with Yasser Qadi about this in particular. He has this kind of experience where he was in Medina, he did his bachelor's and his master's there, and then he went to Yale. And some of the stories, if you ever get the chance to speak with him, I'm not sure, maybe he shared some on his many YouTube videos or whatever, but some of the stories he can tell you about the bias, the anti-Muslim bias, or the suspicion of Muslim sources or Islamic sources within the academy is quite rampant and persistent even to today, right? So all of that to say, and I can talk about that for a long time because that was actually a meaningful divergence in my life where I had the opportunity to go one way and I eventually went the other, and I went abroad to study in a traditional way. But the reason why it comes up here is because we see the results of the education system, right? And why you have to prevent, according to the author, why you have to prevent knowledge from people who have ill intentions or are not sincere or don't have the requisite character to kind of deal with the information that they're learning. So it becomes a duty. He says it's a duty to guard knowledge from the unpurified until they become purified. And he justifies this with an ayah from the Quran, or in Surah An-Nisa, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about money and inheritance, and how you deny the inheritance to the safi, and the foolish person, or the person who is young, they haven't reached maturity yet, until they reach maturity, right? And see, so he says, if that's money, then what about religious knowledge, right? Religious knowledge is even more precious and even more valuable. So of course you would do the same with that. But there's a flip side. There's a flip side. And we've talked in previous classes about gatekeeping and how this occurs in the Muslim community too. And in the scholarly class, where somebody comes in and they want to say like, oh, I want to become a scholar of Islam, and I want to study fiqh, and I want to learn all these things, and then regretfully, sometimes they're met with discouraging words, right? Some people say, oh, you have to study this one book for, 30 years, and then maybe you can, tie my sandal strap, like that's regretfully, this is kind of the mentality that some people communicate. And obviously, again, if you look at the conflict of interest that's involved, it's because there's people that want to keep people in a certain position and not let them rise, for fear that they might be one day surpassed. And this comes back to jealousy and lack of character, etc., etc. So the important corollary of the rule that the author sets out is that just as you have a duty to withhold knowledge from the person who doesn't have the character to stomach it, you have the duty or the obligation to provide knowledge to the person who's ready for it. It's not absolutely not acceptable for someone who wants to come in and learn to discourage them in any way. And this comes back to the difference between what type of assessment and evaluation is the teacher doing. We don't reject people based off of their intellect. We don't write somebody off saying like, oh, this person will never be able to understand this. You stick to, alif bata, and we'll be the big boys up here doing, inheritance law or things like that. No, you take the person where they're at, you work on them and develop them, and you hope, if you're sincere, you hope that one day they'll even surpass you. And that's the mark of a sincere teacher. Whereas the only sort of filtering out that should happen is the filtering out that happens on the basis of character. And that's the teacher's job. The teacher's job is to differentiate between character first, and then to take people under his wing. Not just, it's like, okay, you go out and hang out on the street corner because you're just a rotten apple and can't have you in here. Take them under their wing, but note that it's not necessarily for, okay, it's time to learn, but we have to square away a couple other things first when it comes to your character, with your service, your sense of mission, etc., etc., etc. And that's where the chapter ends. Next chapter is about building educated leaders and the importance of educated leaders and an ecosystem of learned leadership, which is directly applicable to community life, running a masjid, running a religious nonprofit. So I look forward to that. Anyone have any questions or comments about anything that's been gone over in this particular class or anything else? Come on, give me something. Nothing from the Sheikh family. The Sheikh family is always with me online, mashallah. So the Prophet ﷺ said, "Kullukum ra'in wa kullukum." Yes, teaching at appropriate times is very important. That's right. And every one of us is a teacher at the end of the day, in the Muslim community, when it comes to our children and all the children that we interact with. All of us are, at least for 5 minutes a day, we're an instructor, we're an educator. So these are all reminders for myself and reminders for all of us. We can all work on implementing them, inshallah. If that's all, I thank everybody for attending tonight. May Allah benefit us by the knowledge that He provided. Alhamdulillah, salatu, alhamdulillah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.